When we think of blackened magic, a few things probably come to mind: parasitism, selfishness, amorality, and greed. These are the defining characteristics of blackened magic. Greatness at any cost is a great motto for the color's philosophy, and in Cube there is plenty of potential for greatness. So other than the pretty obvious pick for Reanimator being the black deck in Cube, which is a super viable option and you can definitely do that along with another archetype, I actually have a whole other video about Reanimator on my channel. One of my favorite things to build out of mono black is more along the lines of a disruptive aggro or a stacks based deck. So before we get into this video, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more videos like this. And it just makes my lizard brain feel good to watch the numbers go up. So the game plan for decks like this is to play creatures and spells that generate card advantage and disrupt our opponent's board or hand, while at the same time gradually building our own position to incrementally chip away at our opponent's life, while ensuring they can't get anything to stick on the board. This is going to give us a few pretty clear boxes to check: hand disruption, removal, taxing or stacks abilities, and threats. For a card to be an ideal candidate for this archetype, it helps to usually at least do two of these things and do them decently well. The first thing we're going to look at for this deck is hand disruption. Most of the typical 1 and 2 mana discard spells are pretty much auto-includes in a deck like this. So this means Thoughtseize, Duress, Inquisition, and Hymn to Turok. These are all pretty straightforward and most of you probably already know what they do pretty well. Hymn to Turok is probably the most valuable out of these, as getting 2 cards for 1 is incredibly powerful. There's also modal cards like Collective Brutality, which also doubles as removal and a drain effect if we need it to. Kolaghan's Command is another great option if we splash into red, which we're pretty likely to do in a deck like this, and also gives us the valuable versatility to recur creatures, deal damage, and also destroy artifacts, which is something black on its own has a lot of trouble with usually. Mind Twist is another super powerful discard spell, especially in a cube with fast mana, when you can take advantage of getting rid of as many cards as possible really early on in the game. We also want to have a few disruptive creatures that do similar things with our opponent's hand, like Kitesail Freebooter, Brain Maggot, and Tidehollow Sculler if we're splashing white. All of these essentially hold a card hostage as long as these creatures are still in play. Although my favorite creatures in this category are going to be Acquisitions Expert, who can potentially snag more than 1 card if you have the right creature types, and Yarok's Finlurker, who just exiles a card when it enters the battlefield. To me, these are better in that your opponent can't get the cards we take back by killing these creatures. It also means we have some expendable bodies to power some of our other engines. Speaking of those other engines, Braid's Cabal Minion is a 4 mana creature that says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices an artifact, creature, or land. And while this does hurt us too, combined with what we're going to be doing to our opponent and having ways to create disposable bodies, this is going to be a way less balanced effect most of the time. Cards like Bitter Blossom and Ophiomancer go great with Braids to build small armies on their own and really break the symmetry of Braids' ability. Braids is really the backbone of a lot of these decks, and usually when drafting mono black, this is one of the cards that can pull me into the archetype. Priest of the Forgotten Gods is another great outlet for these lingering creatures to add some incremental value. Being able to ping your opponent for 2, force them to sacrifice a creature, and we get to draw a card and add 2 mana at the cost of sacrificing 2 creatures, which is a big cost, but it is one we don't mind paying a lot of the time. And another popular cube card that I think is at its best in this deck is Skull Clamp. If you're unfamiliar, Skull Clamp is an equipment that essentially says pay 1 and sacrifice a creature to draw 2 cards. With the tokens that this deck makes, this is a card drawing machine, especially with cards like Bitter Blossom and Ophiomancer. Also in the card advantage camp, we have Dark Confidant to keep our hand full. With this deck usually running pretty low to the ground, the life loss from this is almost always negligible. Another thing this deck wants plenty of is cards that make it harder for our opponent to cast things. Traditional stacks pieces go great in this deck, like Smokestack and Tanglewire. Both of these, of course, being symmetrical abilities, but similarly to Braids, in this deck we're nearly guaranteed to come out ahead in most matches. We also want cards that tax our opponent and make it harder for them to cast things while we're starving them on resources. Sphere of Resistance and Thorn of Amethyst both do this quite well, along with Lodestone Golem, who has the upside of coming with a pretty decent body. All 3 of these just make spells cost more, which again is symmetrical, but I'm sure you get the picture by now. We can also disrupt our opponent's lands directly with cards like Sinkhole and Army Ants, again if we end up splashing red, which this deck probably wants to. Strip Mine and Wasteland are always welcome additions to a deck like this as well, and having access to cards like Crucible Worlds to replay them from the yard makes them, as well as Army Ants, that much more valuable. And of course, Rashad Port is a classic taxing land that slots in perfectly to this deck's mana base. Speaking of mana bases, if you have one to support it, this archetype can also be a great opposition deck, which I've also already done a whole other video on if you haven't seen it. There are a few cards that just do everything this deck wants, most notably Smallpox, which is a card that makes each player lose a life, discard a card, sacrifice a creature, and sacrifice a land. Liliana the Veil is another card I'm sure most of you know and either love or hate. She rips hands apart, she kills creatures, and if you can get her ultimate off, she just blows up half of our opponent's board. Pretty great value in this deck. And a newer inclusion that I've been really happy with in this deck is Rankle, Master of Pranks. For 4 mana, we get a 3/3 flyer with haste that lets you choose any of the following. When it deals combat damage to a player, each player discards a card, loses 1 life and draws a card, or sacrifices a creature. Another new card I've been really excited to try out in Cube is Turok Dreadcanter. Turok is a 2 mana 2/1 with protection from white with the additional kicker cost of 2 black. If we pay Turok's kicker, we get a Hymn to Turok attached to him when he enters the battlefield, and every time an opponent discards a card, Hymn to Turok gets a +1/+1 counter. So if we pay the kicker, this enters as a 4/3, and if we cast a single hand disruption spell after this, he's just going to get bigger and bigger. And another card I've had a lot of fun playing is Death Cloud. For 3 black and X, each player loses X life, discards X cards, sacrifices X creatures, then sacrifices X lands. So with enough mana put into this, obviously if we're ahead on life, we can just end a game with this. However, even casting this for less mana and getting a less grandiose effect is sometimes just worth it. And the last key piece to this deck is going to be creature removal, something that Black excels at. While it never hurts to have a board wipe or 2 as an emergency reset button, my favorites being Toxic Deluge and Damnation, single target removal is something we want in excess. Fatal Push takes care of small threats super easily, Heartless Act answers nearly everything, the newly printed Damn does answer everything that can be destroyed, and Murderous Rider can tag creatures as well as planeswalkers, in addition to coming with a 2/2 lifelinker. One of my favorite pieces of removal, however, is Executioner's Capsule, which may come as a shock because on paper, this card kind of looks like hot trash. The capsule is a 1 mana artifact that you can sacrifice and pay 2 to destroy a non-black creature, which isn't very good. But with the introduction of Lurrus, especially as a companion, we can recast this turn after turn from the graveyard and answer just about any non-black threat an opponent could have. Lurrus in general is an amazing inclusion for this deck, either as a companion or just part of the deck. Being able to recast any of our hand disrupting creatures and sacrifice them to Braids, for example, is one of the strongest engines for a deck like this. So of course, when you're building an archetype that encompasses the bulk of an entire color in Cube, you have near endless options, and this is by no means the only way to build mono black into your cube. So what does black look like in your cube? Do you like supporting stack strategies, or is that not fun to you? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.